I'm First Sergeant Floyd. Welcome to the first iteration of our podcast. I'm First Sergeant of the 135th Signal Company in Kansas City, Missouri, Army National Guard. And with me is Sergeant Cristia.
I'm Sergeant Cristia. I am the Preventive Medicine NCO for the 229th Multifunctional Medical Battalion. I'm also going to be an augmented NCO for the new 205th Ground Ambulance Company housed out of St. Louis. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me, First Sergeant.
The reason we're doing this is because we see a gap in leadership training and learning. Aside from the SSD classes and the resident courses, there's just something that's not there to prepare somebody for the next level of leadership for the job they're going to have to walk into. So that's the whole reason that we're going to put on these podcasts. And the reason why I have Sergeant Cristia here with me is because he's an excellent resource for leadership training and mentorship. He's helped me throughout the years with different kind of classes, and he's just a great resource to bounce this stuff off of as we discuss our subjects today. And what I wanted to discuss today was first a little bit about my history, and then we'll go into the art versus science of leadership. We'll talk about developing a training program where you are at your unit, and officer enlisted relationships, particularly junior officers and senior NCOs. Mm-hmm. So a little bit about me. I joined the National Guard in 2007 as a PFC. I made First Sergeant in 10 years, and I've deployed once to Iraq and once to Kuwait. I find myself in a First Sergeant slot, and I see some gaps in my unit where training hasn't taken the course that I want it to, and I want leadership to be a part of all the training that we do, not just teaching a particular task, but also teaching leadership tenets. And as a First Sergeant of a unit, it's really my job to see that that gets done. Otherwise, the cycle of people not being prepared for their next job will continue unless we put a big focus on realistic, practical, on-the-ground leadership training. What do you think?
I think that's fantastic. And also from the perspective of junior enlisted, so I'm a E5 going through school to become an E6, it's frustrating when you have to experience leadership that is lacking, or that you have this desire or want to excel, but you feel like you don't know what to do because you don't have guidance or leadership. So I think it's important not only from the senior enlisted leadership perspective, but to understand that no matter what level you are at in your career in the National Guard, that you have an impact on the leadership culture of your organization. And this is important to really take in and experience and try to do everything you can to make your group better.
And I want to put it out there right now that what we're doing here is completely voluntary. It's what you call
discretionary effort.
We're doing this for one reason, and that is to help other soldiers and to help the cause. We see a need. This is our way of trying to fill it, and that's what else can I say about that?
Nothing. Let's do this.
Okay, so we're going to try and keep this casual, but informative. And let's start with leadership and talk about the art and science of leadership.
The art and science. You want me to go first, or you want to go first?
You go first.
All right, so leadership, there are probably 40 different models of leadership that are out in the world. The Army has their own form of leadership. Joint Doctrine has their own form of leadership. And the question is, we all can argue what is leadership, but I think it's important to recognize that there are two distinctive characterizations of leadership. There are a soft art form of leadership, and then there's the hard science or methods of leadership. So the art and science. So the art part of leadership is the ability to communicate with people, have an influence. So in the Army doctrine, for example, we talk about character and influence, like your ability to empower the soldiers to be able to do the things that you need them to do, especially from a senior level like yourselves. Or even my level as an E5, soon to be an E6, we have to be able to take the tasks that are delegated to us and then empower the junior enlisted to do the best job and help us out and accomplish the mission that we need. So that's kind of the art form that we can talk about later. The science is the actual methodology. You'll hear things like time management, or if you're in the private sector and you hear concepts like lean manufacturing principles, or how to be an agile organization, or how to communicate effectively using different personality styles, or Myers-Briggs or DISC assessments or things like that. So I think when we're talking about leadership, and if we're instructing future leaders of the organizations, we have to acknowledge that there's two distinct skills that we have to develop. Kind of my thoughts.
Well, so that means that everybody's going to have to stay conscious, always conscious of what those two sides are, the art versus the science of leadership. Mm-hmm. But I also want to mention that leadership is a word that's thrown around a lot. Mm-hmm. It's a big word. It means so many different things to different people. No matter what stellar leader you look up to or admire, they're going to have a different definition of leadership than the other person does. Mm-hmm. And you hear leadership, 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 and I think to the rank and file it's more of an abstract concept than something that you can actually practice right now. Mm-hmm. And there's things that you can do throughout the day to demonstrate leadership. It's not just a definition in an FM, and it's not just an abstract concept of management. So what I try to do is break it down to my soldiers, and it's the art and the science, but there's the way that you carry yourself and the things that you do demonstrate leadership. If we talk about the definition, the military definition of leadership, it is the influence or the process of influencing people by giving the purpose, direction, and motivation to accomplish the mission and improve the organization. Right. Now, it's a long, lengthy book definition of the word leadership, but we can break that down and see how that plays out over the course of a training day or what you're doing. So we talk about influencing. Mm-hmm. I think influencing and motivation are
two distinctly different things.
Okay,
for sure. So influencing is the ability to create followers. That's really at the core of any leadership philosophy, is you have to have followers to be a leader, which is why that's different than management. You can be a great manager but not be a leader because nobody wants to follow you in a direction or path. Influencing is convincing or sharing a vision and creating followers. So you think of people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi or any George Washington. To be able to communicate a vision and people to be drawn to that is the ability to influence, which is absolutely key and vital in our organization. Because if if we got to charge the hill, or if you got to do a training plan or whatever you're doing, if you can't have people buy into that concept, then it'll never be executed at the level it needs to be.
Now here's a good example. I was having an orientation brief with one of my new soldiers, the last drill. Mm. And when I have an orientation brief with a new soldier, I really try to break it down for them and talk to them like a human being and not so much like first sergeant to private. There's a way to do that. There's the first sergeant to private manner of speaking to somebody. Mm. And then there's the, hey, we're both adult people. Let me tell you what I expect and what you can expect out of me, and have a conversation about it. You're not losing respect for the rank, you're not losing professionalism or discipline, but you're having a respectful, mutual conversation. So that's what I try to do to my new soldiers. And as I'm telling this new soldier about how I lead, and I talk about the definition of leadership, which I put in the brief, and I said, I talked about motivating, how motivation is a key part of leadership. And he says, well, if I'm in charge, why would I have to motivate anybody? Because if I'm a sergeant and I'm telling the private to do something, they're just going to do it because I'm the private. So I don't see why I would have to motivate anybody. So what would you say to him?
I would say you have to connect people to the purpose that is within themselves. So everybody joins the military or any organization for their own reason. And the key for a leader is to be able to connect that personal reason to the great reason of the organization. So, we're in medical, so if somebody says, well, I needed to help pay for college, join the military to pay for college, why do I need to motivate others? I can say, well, how is you being here and us helping you pay for college, how are you going to help inspire other people to reach their goals, especially as a leader? So I would say that an individual who thinks that I can't, I shouldn't lead, or why am I responsible for motivating, they have to understand that people won't do great things unless they're connected to that purpose. That's what I would say.
Because I try to relate, I guess, so well to my soldiers and explain things in a way that they can understand and act on, I really break down the definition of leadership and how it can play out. And I use motivation as a part of that because I think motivation also bonds the soldier to the leader. Yes, you'll do what I say because I'm a first sergeant and you're a private, and I say mop the floor, and you're going to go mop the floor. But I want something more out of my soldiers than just obedience.
Right.
So there's obedience. That doesn't require any motivation whatsoever. It doesn't require any mentorship or influence. It's just pure obedience. I think the way that you relate to the soldier and the rapport that you build and the mutual respect that you build, that's the motivation, because somebody wants to do it because you want to do it. But let's talk about the definition of leadership and go through the different parts: the influencing, the purpose, direction, and motivation. So I saw in the FM this captain's video I was watching when he broke down leadership. He talked about there were 7 or 9 different methods of influence. And that's the first part of the definition, is influencing people. And we won't go into all those definitions of influence, but there's different ways to influence people. So let's talk about those.
In general, okay. So first would be to have use power as influence. So you're given
rank, you could use power.
You use your rank and say, hey, you need to do this because it's the best for you. Sometimes they'll call it the parent method. Like, I'm here to help you do the best. Do it this way because it's the best for you. And my experience would help you with that. The other is using a reverse technique to help understand, and this is harder but most effective, is communicating the desire, the behavior through the purpose of the individual. So if you and I were, peers, and I'd say, hey, you told me that it's important that you build the best training plan. What am I going to do to help you do that? That would be a method of influencing, and that's a little bit tricky with the conversation. But ultimately, there's 2 broad categories. You either use your power, subordinate, or parent-child method, or you have to communicate it through their values and their desires and wants.
The video that I watched that captain give, he talked about there's a compliance end of the spectrum and there's a commitment end to the spectrum.
Exactly.
Compliance is more the knife hand, and commitment is more of the building rapport and a shared purpose.
Yep.
And I think with the 7 or 9 different methods of influence, half of them fall on the compliance end and half of them fall on the commitment end.
Yeah, and you
want to be right in the middle.
Yeah, well, and you will get more discretionary effort. You'll get more effort from a person if you can always influence them from the commitment end rather than compliance end, almost always, because then you will connect them to the higher purpose for whatever reason they were part of the organization, and they'll be willing to go that extra mile because you bought in commitment from them. I mean, it's like asking somebody to lose weight. You can say, you're fat, you need to exercise, or, hey, is it important for you to be the best version of you? How are we going to get there?
And you also have to be fit yourself, or you're not going to have any credibility up front for that person to even buy into what you're saying.
Right.
And that happens a lot too. So that's influence. So let's talk about purpose, direction, and motivation. And when I give a crude example, if I'm telling somebody to mop the floor, that's the mission. The mission is mopping the floor. But I'm not going to tell you why we're going to mop the floor. I think if you convey to somebody why we're doing whatever we're doing, there's a reason why we're doing this interview. The reason you're mopping the floor is because there's going to be a meeting here tomorrow, and it's going to be filmed, and some high-ranking people are going to be here, and some family members. We want it to look good. That's the reason. So let's talk about how important is it to give a purpose, and is it important to give somebody a purpose when you give them a task, or is it enough in our world? I'm the sergeant, you're the private. Mop this floor. Why bother to flesh out the definition of leadership?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's situations where purpose probably isn't appropriate. Like maybe mopping the floor. There's probably some, what's it called, inherentness to that. Like, hey, obviously we got to mop the floor to keep a space clean and things like that. But I think purpose is really, really important to the more abstract or big concepts, or things that maybe if somebody is becoming more demotivated, like PMCS, that's my favorite example. If anybody doesn't accept or acknowledge that they tried to shortcut a PMCS process, they're lying to you, right? So, but most people don't do that process the correct way. And what I would typically do or have done in the past is I've talked to my soldiers and say, hey, well, why is it important to do a proper PMCS? and connect them to the fact that, without our equipment, we can't maneuver. If we can't maneuver, we can't be effective, especially in the medical world, in the signal world. If you guys can't get your trucks and set up your signal process, then we're ineffective in assisting the infantry or whoever main body you're affecting. And just connecting them with that purpose again can kind of reignite them and say, oh, hey, let's make this serious. So I think it's important in most cases, but I don't think we should get extreme in every case, cleaning the toilet or whatever.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I do give mopping the floor and cleaning the toilet as specific examples when I talk about leadership, only because it's such an easy point to make.
Right.
That if somebody doesn't know why are we doing this, it's going to be okay another
Sure.
day if we don't do it.
Right.
Then you can give a reason. And the fact that you even care enough to give a reason, I think gets some of their buy-in.
I agree.
That you care enough to even include them in the reason why. Not that you need them to agree, because sometimes things just got to get done, and obedience comes into play. But most of the time in our world, that's not the case.
True.
And direction, when I talk about direction, if we're giving the mop and the floor example, and I say, go mop the floor, but I don't tell you what mopping the floor means, I don't tell you where to get the mop, and I don't provide you with a bucket or water, then I'm setting you up for failure.
Right.
So that's the example that I give for direction. You have to give somebody direction.
Right. Yeah, you gotta paint the picture. You gotta begin with the end in mind always. Oftentimes you hear that phrase, especially as NCOs, you'll hear the phrase "commander's intent." That's important because you gotta set the direction. I want to go over there, and it's our responsibility to then determine what the best way to get over there is. Same thing with mopping the floor. You have to say, this is what the standard is. I need you to go do that.
And I think it's appropriate that if it's a task not as mundane as mopping the floor, but something else where they don't know what success looks like, or they don't know what right looks like, then you take the time, a couple of minutes, do an area or a spot or something, and show them this is an example of what right looks like and what I expect the end result to be. So I think you're fostering credibility, and you're ensuring their success. Another example I give is the training program I'm trying to build in my unit when I'm giving classes, and I want to build a leadership program. I just don't want to have a block of time on the schedule for NCODP, because it's easy enough for somebody just to pick a subject out of an FM or a slideshow and just read the slides. And that is the class that is conducted. I want something more out of the classes, so it's on me to lead that, and the way I did it is I gave the first class. And I gave the first class, and while I was doing it I was explaining why I was doing it and the format that I wanted it to follow, and the result that I wanted out of the entire program was an increased sense and ownership of leadership, and not just learning how to do a specific task. So I think that's why direction is important. You don't want to set somebody up for failure. And when I got to motivation, purpose, direction, motivation is more of the art, because different things motivate different people. And there's a difference between motivation and inspiration, or being driven. So let's talk about those differences between just being motivated and then being driven or inspired.
Yeah, motivation, you have to understand the person, I think. You have to really dig into what drives them, and you have to ask questions like, how do you like to be recognized? What's important to you? Why are you here? What are your goals? What are your aspirations? What are your dreams? And use the art form and communicate that consistently with them to help bring back purpose and direction, connect with their reason, with your purpose and direction to help drive that. I think really that's, if you think about it, the formula for influence, to be able to do all of that together. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was thinking about motivation, and there's a difference between being motivated to do something. For example, if I say, I'll give you a $20 bill if you run real fast and bring me that duffel bag. That's a motivator.
Right.
Okay, now does that mean that you were driven to do that? That's why you were born? I mean, that's what drives you forward, is the fact that you can get a duffel bag faster than anybody else? I mean, that's why you get up in the morning? Probably not.
Right.
So there's times to motivate people. When you're sprinting across the finish line during a PT test and you have your commander there yelling for you, or you're running alongside you, that's a great motivator. but something else is driving you to even be good at PT in the first place. Not this particular event, but there's something else inside you that wants you to be better at being a soldier and better at being fit. And that's why you're trying so hard during the PT test anyway. But when we talk about motivation, and I'm going back to that conversation I had with the private, and so far we've talked a lot about the word leadership, and we're breaking down the definition, and it's probably a lot for people who aren't bought into this whole, I guess, study of leadership and why it's important. You show up to drill, you do what you're told. They don't want to think this much about leadership, and make it a doctoral thesis every time they walk in the armory to talk about leadership. So that's why I try to keep it really simple. And when we're talking about connecting the person to why they, whatever mission it is, and you're talking about what motivates them, the simple example that I give if we're talking about mopping the floor, cleaning the toilet, is I try to show that I'm excited for whatever it is the mission is. I'm not down. I have to provide a good example. So I'm excited, I'm upbeat, and they know by my demeanor that I'm going to give them purpose and direction. I'm not going to leave them hanging because they know that much about me in the first place. And hey, I'm going to do it with you. So there's buy-in and credibility as a leader. There's no reason why I wouldn't unless I have something more important to do. And then if we get this done and we do it right and we do a great job, guess what? I'll we'll knock off a half a day, or I'll go buy you a burger or whatever. That's a motivator. It's a short-term motivator, but I think it does a lot to foster a good leadership relationship with your follower. Yeah. Especially if that's how you do things all the time.
Yeah. So that kind of goes into building that culture of discretionary effort. That inspiration comes from that consistent execution of motivating and driving and providing purpose and direction. I think somebody who becomes inspired is they're just in that environment so much that then they're willing to go the extra mile to accomplish that, because it comes from an internal self thing. I think that's really the key difference between motivation and inspiration. Because if I say, hey, I want to wake up and I want to help First Sergeant Floyd accomplish his mission, I think it's inspiration. For you to say, hey, if you get done in an hour, I'll cut you guys loose 3 hours early. I think that mix of things consistently is what drives that culture. And then you really transform your organization from there.
When I give a class or I'm giving a lesson, I try to live the definition of leadership throughout the class. And so I get to the part where accomplishing the mission, and if we're talking about mopping the floor, we're back to mopping the floor again. That was the mission, to clean the floor. And that's easy enough to identify, but how does that improve the organization? And if you're going to live or demonstrate the entire definition of leadership, then you have to at least show or explain why what you're doing improves the organization.
Oh yeah, and I think just kind of caveating on that, it's important to constantly flex that muscle. Leadership and building that culture requires effort, like a relationship with a spouse or another human. A relationship within your organization is no different. You have every little thing that we do that can foster that is important, like uniform. One of the key things, not just protecting ourselves from environmental threats, but the fact that we're so disciplined in our uniform, that practice of discipline there will be transferred to every other exercise. Shaving your face every day, standing at parade rest. I mean, there's no benefit of standing at parade rest when you talk to a senior NCO, except the fact that you're flexing that discipline muscle, and that will transfer to when you're in the field, to when you're trying to plan or doing whatever you're doing. I think that's important.
That's a good point when you talk about the discipline, and it brings to mind drill and ceremony, because when you're in basic training, or when I was in OCS, or whatever training environment that you're in, and your toothbrush has to be 3 inches from the edge of the counter, and your soap has to be countered 45 degrees, and your boots have to be lined up so, and one of them is not right, and you get balled out, and you're doing push-ups. Part of your brain could be thinking, what's the difference? How is the world a worse place because my razor was cantered 3 degrees the other way?
Right.
And of course, the world isn't worse because your razor was cantered.
Of course not.
It goes into, these are exercises in discipline and exercises in obedience, because there's going to come a time, as much as we talk real touchy-feely and inclusiveness about how we demonstrate leadership in our current environment, there's going to come a time in some environment where you just have to obey and do what you're told, because it's going to be that critical. And so just knowing that you're able to do that, no matter how mundane it is important.
Yep. Because if you can't do the little things right, how can you do the big things right?
Yeah. So I think people lose sight of that, is, especially with military bearing, when you're in a garrison environment and it's kind of laid back.
Yep.
And you lose that. And then when somebody comes in and wants to tighten that up right away, then it's a culture shock, because you're used to just being laid back.
Right.
And you don't know why you have to go to parade rest or
Right.
call somebody sir and sergeant the right way.
But in fairness, going back to what we're saying, if that person communicated that purpose and the reason why they do that, I don't think there would be much of a culture shock. If you go to your unit right now and say, hey, every time I walk in the door, everybody's gonna stand up, call at ease, and that whole shebang, and you explain why, the same conversation we're having now. The reason we do this is because every opportunity to exercise discipline makes us that much better, all the way to uniform, to customs and courtesies, to drill and ceremony. That just makes us better. And you're practicing that, providing direction, motivation, and you're using influence to get a job done. And no matter what rank you are, you can do that.
And here's a good example. We're talking about discipline in the garrison environment. It makes it harder to enforce that type of discipline when a even higher ranking individual doesn't practice that.
Yep.
And that does erode discipline greatly. And the way to overcome that is if you're directly in charge of these soldiers, you say, it doesn't matter what that higher ranking person is doing now, they're setting a poor example for the standard that you're trying to set.
Yep.
But you still must do these things.
Yep.
And you don't have control over everything. Like to have control over everything, but some people of a higher rank, they're gonna do what they do.
Right.
And there's only so much you can do about that. So yeah.
That's what, you guys got to always remember, and man, we could have a whole nother podcast about this, but you got to take responsibility to yourself and say, hey, I understand the standard. And really, in theory, one senior individual shouldn't be able to compromise a whole company of non-compromised individuals. Like in a hypothetical example, let's say a commander, let's say I'm your commander and I don't follow a standard. You being my first sergeant would then push the standard and should be able to overcome that with the troops. Yeah, it does kill your culture and it does create a very harsh environment for people, because we would say, oh, why does that person not have to pass height and weight, or why do they not have to pass a PT test? But just gotta remember, you gotta take care of yourself and keep responsibility there.
And I make a point of that too, is it doesn't matter how many dirt bags you have around you. If you don't want to be a dirt bag, then the fact that the other people are doing the other things isn't going to get to you. If I have 5 colonels standing around me with their hands in their pockets, I'm still not going to put my hands in my pocket, because I know that that's not the right thing to do. That's not how I was raised in the Army. I know the world isn't going to end if I put my hands in my pockets, but I'm just not going to do that. So the fact that somebody else is not maintaining a standard that's around you doesn't have to erode your own standard.
Right, exactly.
Look, I know that we're in the National Guard, and I know that we only have 2 days a month, and that's 16 to 18 hours per month that we're in the Armory. And why in the world do we spend this much time talking about this stuff? Because the discretionary effort that you need to put in to succeed can be so little, or it can be so much. The reason why we're doing this is just to educate people and influence people to do better things. That's the only reason why we're doing this.